Welcome to the speaker series on a shot glass of recovery.
Yeah. You get a house, you get a car, then you start thinking that's all you are, but you don't know the truth. So let me spell it out for you. Now I got your attention, now there's a start. Now sit and listen to my favorite part. Life's been giving us some clues. The answer lies inside of you.
I am Lisa, the host of A Shot Glass of Recovery, and this is our speaker series. Let's sit back and get ready for some more experience, strength, and hope.
All right, thank you. This is unusual. I don't have much. I haven't did this in a while. I do leads regularly, but the Zoom, I don't know. It's pretty cool too. But my name is Daniel Payne. I'm an alcoholic. And my sobriety date is September the 25th, 1989. And I'm sober only by God's grace. And as she said, my home group is the Pathfinders group on Thursday night at 7:30, and a pretty cool meeting. Maybe 30, 35 people, and it's a good group. We do a lead, then we do a 12 and 12, then a big book, and the last week maybe we might do another lead or something of that sort. But I'm just so glad to be here today, and I was wondering where Stacy was at, but it doesn't matter, because I'm here to get help. And I don't even know if I can help anybody in this meeting tonight, but I know one of the reasons that I go to Alcoholics Anonymous is to get help, you know. And, I got a sponsor that's been sober for quite some time, and I sponsor guys. And I like all kind of meetings, big book, open discussion, 12 and 12. It doesn't matter to me, because on the night of September the 25th, 1989, I was in a desperate situation. And I had went to I was at a treatment place, and I was running from the law. I was always running from the law. I was always in trouble, always in jail. And on that night, something happened. The people from Alcoholics Anonymous came in this treatment place, and they was joyous. They were happy. And I was joyous and I was happy. I'd been smoking pot, and I certainly didn't believe that I was an alcoholic. And they started the meeting, and I was giggling all through the meeting. And after the meeting, I remember I went back to my room, and I heard some good stuff. And it wasn't really enough to convince me that I was alcoholic or I was gonna really do something about my problem. I just remember thinking that, wow, that guy gave a pretty decent talk. I didn't know about no lead or nothing like that. I just said he gave a good talk, and I remember I prayed. I come from a good family where my parents took me and my brothers and sisters to church, and I remember for once in a long time, I got on my knees and I just said, God help me, you know. And I remember my roommate came in the room, and we was always in trouble with the law. And he saw me, and I remember him saying, "Man, are you on your knees praying?" And I said, "No, I'm down here looking for my socks." And the thing that was so funny about it is, well, it ain't even funny. That guy probably hasn't drawn a sober breath since we left that treatment center, and I've been sober ever since. And you talk about the grace of God, you know. And I remember those people came back maybe a week or so later, and another person gave a talk. And I remember I went back to my room that time, and I gave while I was praying again. My roommate came in and he said, "Wow, man, you believe that stuff? Are you on your knees praying again?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Yeah." Because I've always believed that there was a God, but it was never really meaningful. If I was in trouble, I'd call out God's name, "God, please help me." But this time I was fully and I was confident, that like, man, I don't care what you say. Something is happening to me that I don't realize what's going on. And that's just it. This is going inside internally as well as externally, to get all that garbage out. And somehow, you know, I was going to these meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. I left that place and went over to a treatment center. It was residential. Maybe it was from 6 months to a year. And they took us to meeting every night. Or we had a meeting in this place. And and I could feel a little better about myself. I was beginning to take showers on a regular basis. And my clothes was clean. My hair was real, real long. I had long curly hair and I thought I don't know, I must have thought I was famous or something. Cause the girls at AA was rubbing all in my hair. I guess I felt like a movie star or something. And but I was beginning to like what had happened to me, in the meetings and me being an active member of Alcoholics Anonymous right from the beginning, you know. And I come from a family where all five of my brothers, we've been incarcerated in state prisons. And, my mother got calls in that house from public drunkenness to aggravated burglary to aggravated robbery to aggravated murder. And I'm here to tell you, my mother did not deserve that type of treatment from her sons. And, I can just remember my mother was a good person in church. She was like the president of different auxiliaries and the ladies' aid. She sung in the senior choir. And she had some boys that was real clever and they was mischievous because me and my brothers wasn't really bad or nothing like that. We started developing bad habits and we were starting to drink and use drugs. And I'm here to tell you, I'm no drug addict. I was just an alcoholic who used drugs. That's it. Alcohol put me right in the center of life and drugs took me right out of it, and when I went over to that treatment center, I still had those charges. I had charges pending. I would have never went in no treatment, if I wasn't in no type of trouble. My brother, he murdered this guy. He stabbed him to death, in like a robbery. And he got sentenced to a 10 to 25 sentence on a manslaughter. And my brother's a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous today. And you talking about a story. My brother got a story to tell. And maybe a year or so later, I stabbed the guy and hurt him real bad. And that's how I really punched my ticket in the Alcoholics Anonymous. And like I said, I wouldn't have came in no AA if I wasn't in no type of trouble or nothing like that. Or if I was trying to get out of a case or something like that. I remember a guy in jail said that, go to AA, man. Tell the judge you in AA and they'll give you some kind of slack or you get some kind of juice, man. They'll look out for you. And that was really the mission that I was on, and I learned all kind of stuff in this treatment place and it started getting me ready for society. And like I said, they would take us to meetings every day and I had fun. I can remember as a kid growing up, I was always smaller than the other kids. And I was like I remember old Mike used to say it all the time. I felt like different from the other kids, or I just felt like one brick short of a load. And so drinking helped me to converse with the girls. We would go to these parties and stuff and dance. And I remember in the beginning, I couldn't dance. I was always well dressed, but I couldn't dance. And I remember, it was this girl. She my friend on Facebook. And she would always come up to me with her little pigtails and she said, you want to dance, Daniel? And I would say no, because I couldn't dance. I was plastered up against that wall. And my buddies would laugh at me, like he can't dance, man. And I remember this guy say, let's go get something to drink. I didn't even know alcohol made you feel like that. And our book says it. Most alcoholics like the effects produced by alcohol. And we went out. My first drink, probably older than some of the people in this meeting, is called Valley High and Ripple Red. And I started drinking this stuff, and I remember coming back to that party, and I was the life of the party. I remember I went up to that girl. I walked up to her and said, "You want to dance?" And she was like, "Yeah." And we was dancing. I was dancing all up on the table and every. I remember even puking on her. But I liked what happened to me that night. I liked it, the effects of alcohol. I drink it all the time, and sometimes I didn't puke, but a lot of times I did. But that saying is most alcoholics like the effects produced by alcohol. I went on to graduate from high school, and I had not a clue of what I was going to do with my life. Not a clue. And thank God I had a mother that was very active in church and social events. And she got me my first job in the Bureau of Unemployment Services. And I remember I wore a little tie and had a little briefcase. I would have thought that was the job I was going to retire from. I worked there approximately maybe 3 to 6 months. And it was like we was getting a new president back in 1972. And a lot of those programs for minority, they was slashed. They was cut. And here I was maybe about 18 years old without a clue of what I was going to do with my life. I got a son that's 20, 21 years old. I'm 71 years old. I know I don't look 71. I'm very active. I like to go out and exercise. I exercise all the time. I eat a lot of vegetables. I would never eat vegetables as a kid. Most of my brothers are much taller than me. But, I eat vegetables a lot. I don't smoke. I don't drink. But anyway, you know, I was terminated. Well, not terminated. The funds left this program for minorities, and here I was. I didn't know what I was gonna do with my life. And I heard a guy said you could probably go to college. I wasn't a bad student. I was just an average student, and it always said on my card, Daniel does not live up to his potential. And, the guy opened me up to different avenues. He said, "Son, you could probably go to a vocational school. You can go to college. Push come to shove, you can get another job." And I decided to go to college. Didn't know the first thing about college. And I'm here to tell you, if I knew you had to pay tuition, I may not have ever went to college. I got a lot of money back then, grants and Ohio instructional grants to go to college because I didn't know you had to pay. Because the first quarter, maybe even the second quarter as well, I was getting this check from my father being a veteran, and it was enough to pay my tuition. I was paying in cash. And I remember the guy, the controller, he would shut his office and march me over to the student the student register, and he would look at the guy and say, "This guy's paying in cash." It was like I was getting special treatment. And little did I know that I could have got these grants and all that. I didn't know till probably about the third quarter that I was really in school. And I love college. I liked the girls, the college girls. I left the girls in high school. Now I was dealing with real women. Women that had dresses on and they had bow ties on, and they were in fraternities and sororities. I remember I was thinking like, man, I must be in heaven. And I joined up with a fraternity. The university did charter. We called it Mad Dog. We were like the old Animal House, and we would act a fool. We would drink all the time, man, go to parties. And as a matter of fact, my grades were starting to slip a little bit. And I developed a way that I could stay in college and drink and pass some of the scores, some of the tests in college, and it's called cheating. I started cheating in college, and I remember I was acing tests and B's, and I remember I would go in the professor's office because most of the curriculums in college, they didn't change a lot. And I would go in the professor's office, and I would slip the test or something like that, and me and somebody else would divert it, get the test, and mimeograph copies, pass it out to the other students. I was a businessman already. I remember my mother would say, "What do you do about money up there?" And I told her I had a work study job. I said I work and then I study. And I couldn't fool my father. Never. I could never fool my father. My father would look at me like, "Man, you full of crap. You full of horse manure." And that's putting it mildly from my dad. And when I came home, I would always bring him a bottle of booze. I wasn't even of legal age to buy alcohol in those days. And back then they would sell it to anybody with money. And so I was getting these good grades and I was sending my grades home to my mother because it seemed like every other weekend I was in another city or something. And I would tell my mother, "I'm in St. Louis." You know what I mean? "I'm in Dayton, Ohio. I'm in Cleveland. I'm in Toledo." And my mother was like, "Wow." And when I would come home, my mother would always ask me to go to church with her, and I would go in. And she was so proud. And she would look at me like I was Albert Einstein somebody. And I'm probably about as dumb as this water I'm drinking. Always look good on the outside. But the inside, it was like what nobody really home. And I did that for years. I cheated my way through college and I graduated. And my uncle had a job for me in New York and I wouldn't take it. That was the first time that I knew that I was in the grips of a progressive illness and it was getting worse. It wasn't getting better. It was getting worse. I have yet to see anybody come back in the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous after a bout of drinking, after a period of sobriety, and say, "Hey, I had a wonderful time out there laying on the street drunk. I just came back to lay down with you guys again and pick up from where I left off." The disease is progressive. It gets worse. It doesn't get better. And my uncle came down here to get me and I wouldn't go. He lived in New York. He lived in Upper Manhattan and he was my mother's favorite brother. And he had left the South and he had did good for himself. And my mother wanted me to do the same thing. And I couldn't go. I always thought I threw that opportunity away. But when I learned as I came to Alcoholics Anonymous that I was in the grips of this illness and it dictated the shots. It told me that you won't be going to New York. You know, you'll be right here. You'll be dating this woman. You'll be right here. And I couldn't go. And my life started falling completely apart. I started going to jail. And it was devastating my mother. And I remember my mom would come and see me like, "What is wrong with you?" I had no idea that I was in the grips of this illness. And it was getting bad. And finally, I robbed some old man, maybe of $15, $20. And I was already on probation for drugs. And I found myself in the Ohio State Penitentiary. And it was no joke. I remember looking at the judge that morning and that gave me repeatedly chances to get away with the stuff, man. And I remember him saying, "Son, I have no alternative but to send you to a definite term in the Ohio State Penitentiary." And I remember I always looked nice going to court, a nice tie, nice suit. And I thought I was going somewhere. And I was going somewhere. I was going to the state prison in Columbus, Ohio. And I'll never forget walking in this place that it was a sign on this wall that it will reflect in my mind as long as I live. It say, "Enter these walls, men with no hope." And that's how I felt. That's how I felt when I came in Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous gave me hope. And I remember walking in this place and, I was surrounded by murderers and rapists and armed robbers and burglars and all kind of people. And I kept feeling like I didn't belong in here. But if you repeatedly violate the law, that's where they're going to take you. And I always thought that maybe this was the worst thing that happened to me. Actually, it was the best thing that ever happened to me because that's why I was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous. I was in a medium security prison, and that's why I was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous. You see, Alcoholics Anonymous in my neighborhood in those projects, it was so anonymous, we didn't know where it was at. Nobody had ever heard of Alcoholics Anonymous. The only way you found out about AA was going to prison. And I remember it would be hundreds of us going to these AA meetings. Everybody had their shirts all starched up, and they had their jeans all starched up, and the people would come in from the outside. And if it was a woman giving a talk, everybody had questions to ask her. And, to me, it was fun, you know, and it was funny more than anything because we would tell the speaker like, pow, 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 tell them to hurry up, man. We got to get out of here. The only thing we was doing was getting our paper signed and, and getting ready for lockup, and then when the parole board come in, show them that we had repeated. I mean, we had did a course in AA. I had no idea the weight that Alcoholics Anonymous would have gave me at that time. And one thing that I learned was the seeds of Alcoholics Anonymous was planted right there in that very prison. I just didn't grow. It's just like if you got a plant or flower, how you have to nurture it, water it to make it grow. And I was nurtured, but I wasn't grown, And I remember the parole board came in and they set me down and they said, look, son, we didn't bring you a parole. I remember looking like, what? Man, I've been down here almost 3 years. I had a 4 to 20 sentence, a 2 to 15 on a robbery, and a 2 to 5 sentence on drugs. And it was because I knew about some parts of the law, but I thought once I went to parole board, the game was over. And it was like, no, we didn't bring you a parole. And back then, it was a light. And you would leave out of the room, and when that light came back on, you went back in the room. And those guys was making a decision with my life. And I remember sitting down. I smoked cigarettes then. I was smoking a cigarette like, man, I probably ain't gonna never get out of here. And that light came on. And I remember I walked back in that room, and I remember the guy said, today must be your lucky day. I looked at him. He said, because we're not going to give you a parole. We're going to give you a work release. And what it is you go back in society. You reintegrate back into society. You get a job, and you just reintegrate back into life, the mainstream of life. And I was saying, thank you. And I remember in those meetings in Alcoholics Anonymous, they said, stay away from the first drink. See, I got the kind of mind that said, I thought they said, take the first drink and see what happens, and, I remember I got out, and that's the first thing I did. I took a drink of alcohol. The alcohol took a drink of me, and I was off and running. And that's the vicious cycle of alcoholism. See, I'm here to tell you, if I take a drink of alcohol, I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know where I'm going to end up. And I didn't get that concept when I first got out of there because they said, stay away from the first drink. And I was in this halfway house drinking on a regular basis. They would give me urinalysis, and I always thought I was clever, I would tape something to my private part and pour it in a cup and hand it to them, and they was like, whoa. I would give them urine that was, it might have been purple, some kind of dish liquid or something. And they was like, whoa, no. And for some reason, you can't really scare drunk, And I started coming clean. They found out I had THC in my urine, and they told me, one more, buddy, and you going back. And somehow, after about a month or so or two, I straightened out my act, and I got out of this halfway house, and I just thought I could do whatever I want, and couldn't have been out a good month, burglarized these people home and robbed them at the same time. And the next thing I knew, I found myself back in jail. I remember my mom looked at me like, what is wrong with you? And I thought, wow, I don't know. I don't know what's wrong with me. The woman that I was living with was like, you stay in too much trouble, And I didn't know what to do. But one thing is, my brother, if you guys ever get to meet him, he's been in prison all his life. He was acting as co-counsel. He could get me out of anything, you know. And I remember when I was locked up this time, I had a nice bankroll of money. And I remember telling him, like, he said, I got a plan. And if you know my brother, my brother's a crook. I said, no, I'm not giving you this money. I'm going to prison with this money, you know. And he said, no, I need the money. I'm going to show you how to get out. And he got the guy to sign a notarized statement that I wasn't a burglar, I wasn't a robber, and I walked out of jail scot-free. And I remember that old saying, stay away from the first drink. And I took that drink and it took me and I was off and running. And that's the way it went all the time. You see, when I take a drink of alcohol, the game's over. I don't know what's going to happen, you know? And I kept repeatedly doing it over and over and over and over again, you know, and it just probably just devastated my mother. You went to college, you had good jobs. My mother had no idea. We didn't even know what alcoholism was. When my brothers would act out, my mama would take us out to some mental hospital and say, something is wrong with my son. And something was wrong with us. We was just alcoholics. And it was right down the street from that nut house. And we didn't know that's what it was. You know I didn't. You know, and finally my brother took this man's life, you know, and that was it. And he went to jail for 10 to 25, and that was it. Couldn't have been a little while after that, I stabbed this guy, and that's how I came into AA, you know. Alcoholics Anonymous gave me a life far beyond that I could even imagine. If you had have told me September the 25th would have been the last day that I took a drink, I probably would have tied it on way better than what I did then. But it was the last time that I took a drink of alcohol, and that was it. You know, I started going to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, and my life forever changed for the better, you know. And the next thing I know, you know, I was going to these meetings regularly. The good thing about it is I started sponsoring guys, you know, and I got a sponsor. I remember I thought the sponsor was the guy that take you down to the department store and buy you clothes, you know, buy you shoes and stuff like that. He just directs you through the 12 steps of AA. And the guy that I had, he had been sober 20 years. And he's a black guy. And you know, because I didn't really talk to a lot of people in AA about my problems. Because I came from a family where, you know, my father would say, we don't talk about stuff outside that goes on in this house. And I knew that. And so when I was talking to this guy, he would always just shake my hand like, thanks for coming, you know, appreciate you showing up. And I would look at him like, what's wrong with him, you know? and and he was a good guy. He was the guy that took me through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. He had a late model car. I think he was an insurance executive. He always wore a little cap or a hat. He always had an umbrella. It wasn't even raining. You know, he had a trench coat and he was a well-dressed guy. And he always had a late model car out front. And you know how they tell you to pick a sponsor. I just said, that's my guy right there. You know, that's him. and and that guy took me through those 12 steps, and I'm forever grateful for it, man. He taught me about sponsorship. You know, he took me to meetings all over the greater Cincinnati area, in other cities and stuff. And I remember him telling me one day, you know, when you take that fourth step, you'll probably start beginning to get happy. And I remember looking at him like, the stuff I did, I'm not telling nobody. I'm not telling them, you know, some of the sexual stuff I did and, you know, people I had done stuff to. And I'm like, no. And here was a guy that I never took a drink with or pot or nothing. And I sit down with him and I told him everything about my life. And I remember he looked at me and he just said, you just blackmailed yourself. You just built the arch to freedom. All the stuff that bound you when you were drinking, you just got free by doing that. And I haven't looked back since. You know, I started doing institution meeting in some of the maximum security prisons in the state of Ohio. And I met some of the most violent and major offenders in the state of Ohio. And I knew some of 'em. You see, Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of attraction, not promotion. We don't go around promoting this stuff. And these guys will see me and like, man, that's Payne's brother, man. Remember that guy was down here? And you remember he was at that other institution? And that's the way it began. These guys were coming into the meet with their pants halfway down. And it's good to see when a man gets on his feet. You know, it's good when you start administering the word of Alcoholics Anonymous to a guy that know nothing about, getting sober or sobriety. And I remember they would come in the meetings and they start asking questions. We talking about some of the most violent offenders in the state of Ohio. And I remember they were really the best meetings that I ever went to. And I love seeing those guys. Them guys would write me letters and stuff. I would see them after 5 or 10 years out on the streets and say, man, I remember you used to come down to Lucasville, man, and I still smoke a little weed, man, or I might drink a beer once in a while, but I appreciate you coming. And it always gave me hope. Some of those guys were sober. And I went on, and I loved the girls in AA. They were always pretty. I had long curly hair. You couldn't tell me nothing. And I started dating them. I remember my father say, "Don't lie to them." I may have told a small lie or something like that, but I just couldn't resist the girls, and I've always had fun with her. And I remember at this time I was almost 50 years old, and my sister, I had a good job, and I remember my sisters told me, "Why don't you come to this wedding?" And I was making $15, $20 an hour back then. And that was good money. And I said, I'm tired, and my sister said, gonna be a lot of pretty girls there and a lot of good soul food. I said, I'm putting my suit on right now, you know. And I went to this wedding, and there she was. As a matter of fact, I was talking to my ex-wife last night. I'm like, look, leave me alone. But anyway, there she was. And she had this when she didn't have a baby with her then, she was well dressed and she was just beautiful. And I remember I was tongue tied. I remember looking at her. She said, "What's wrong with you?" And I told her, I said, "I never seen a woman as beautiful as you." And she was like, "Look, I heard that line a million times." And I was like, "Wait." And I remember I asked my sister, "Who is that girl?" She said, "That's some girl that goes to my church." I turned around, she was gone. She vanished in the air. I remember running outside the hall where they was having the reception, and she was gone. That Sunday, I was in that church with that Bible they gave me in jail, and I sit right in front of her, and she must have, I should have been an actor. That's what I should have been. Because I gave a grand performance. The preacher was preaching. I was like, hallelujah, glory, and all of that. And after the meeting, she asked me, she said, "Are you a Christian?" I said, "Yeah." I couldn't even spell Christian. But anyway, we started going out, we started dating, and eventually we got married. And she didn't know nothing about AA. She would just think that I could just quit. And that people could just quit drinking. And I remember we would have dinner over here in the house. And she said, "My father's a minister, and I've had this baby out of wedlock. And we ain't gonna be having no sex, or we ain't gonna be having nothing like that." And I wasn't even really worried about that because she was such an attractive woman. And I remember sometimes too, prior to us getting married, my sister would be over here. I was married, and they would have a bottle of some kind of Manischewitz wine or something. It was something that maybe had 5% alcohol in it. And they would be drinking. And she would say, "Honey, how come you just can't take one drink?" And I would tell her, one drink is too many and 1,000 ain't enough. And she said, "What's wrong with you? You can't just take one drink and stop." I said, "If I take a drink of alcohol, honey, I might be on Channel 12 News tonight because I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what's going to happen. And it must have been, yeah, it could have been what, maybe 3, 4 months later, She said she was pregnant. We honeymooned out in Florida, and we just had a grand time, came back. My wife said she was pregnant. And I'm like, what? Were you pregnant by? She said, you fool, you my husband. I was 50 years old, I was like, what? And my son is 20, 21 years old. And I tell you, he the love of my life. My son is nothing like me. I helped raise that daughter of hers. And, me and Poopy, we have a lot of fun, but she mad at me right now. Because she came in this house one day, her and some other little girl, after the divorce of me and my wife, and they had been drinking. They had been smoking pot. And I took her and I sit her right on this couch. I say, sweetheart, your pops, she always called me Pops. She still called me Pops. I said, your pops used to smoke and drink all the time. I never had license, no car insurance, and I had one DUI. And I was very fortunate I didn't hit nobody in that car. You may not be that fortunate. I don't smoke weed, I don't drink. And I said, I'm just telling you because I love you. I don't want you driving in that car under the influence of alcohol or drugs because it could change your whole life. And I wish somebody had told me that. But I'm just letting you know, man. She was mad. She's still upset with me about that. And but my life just it goes on. Like I said last night, me and my ex-wife was talking, and she always said you did a good job with the kids. They financially okay. As a matter of fact, I didn't know divorce went that way for women because I made twice as much money as my wife, and they compensated them. I started. AA was the most important thing in my life, and I would go to meetings all the time, and I would be out of town, and sometimes I would be the guest speaker at a banquet dinner in another city or whatever, and I was going all over, and I don't go like that as much now, but I was on fire for AA, and I would get back, and my wife we would argue, and I would tell her, AA is the most important thing in my life. I wish I did, say that, because I had an obligation to my kids and her. And we started arguing around the clock. And one day I pushed it and I smacked her. And I'm no domestic violent person, but that was a domestic violent act. And she forgave me, but she said, "You gonna get out of this house and I'm gonna divorce you." And I was like, whatever. And I pleaded with her, but she said no. And we got divorced, and I still supported the family and all that. And I'm just glad that we friends today. She'll call me and talk to me about anything, the kids and all of that. But I made that mistake. And I remember I had went to this funeral, a friend of mine in college. His mom had passed, and I went. That was probably the first time that I ever wasn't thinking of the bitterness that I had from that divorce. And I started going to church on a regular basis. The church in AA is totally different. It's a separate entity. I like the church because I get the opportunity to learn about the Bible and I learn about God. In AA, I learned about sobriety and I learned about principles about living in life. And I combine them both. Everybody don't need what I need. And I got active. I became an usher. I worked in the hospitality room. It's almost the same as AA, but it's different venues, different entity. And I like to have fun. I started going to this Bible study. It's funny too, because this lady told me, baby, you are doing so good. You don't need that AA stuff. And I looked at her, I said, I need AA. I said, as a matter of fact, I need Alcoholics Anonymous from the first day I came in here because the disease is so progressive. As a matter of fact, if I don't go to AA, that fur coat you got over there, it might come up missing. So I need AA and I need AA practically every day of my life. And my life is a miracle in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I worked a job for 30 years in a manufacturing plant where I got a pension. And I remember they wasn't going to even hire me when they found out that I had a criminal record. You talk about the grace of God. I believe in God, but it wasn't meaningful. And I work with people. I remember my boss would say, "You don't talk a lot." And I thought, like, man, I don't really know these people. I have a family to raise. I got tuition to pay. Them guys were talking about drinking. I remember a guy came up to me one time and he said, "I heard you go to them AA meetings. You don't look like no alcoholic." I said, "How do an alcoholic look?" You know, he said, "You don't look like one. You always well dressed. Sometimes you come to work in a sport jacket." And I worked at a manufacturing plant. My boss would even ask me, the general manager, because my mom always kept the kids clean and taught us how to dress. I remember I had a sport jacket on one time. He said, "Man, where did you get that jacket?" I said, "What? I got this out of my closet." He would always laugh. And he would say, "Man, you got to be the most well-dressed man in the manufacturing plant I ever seen." And I was just laughing because I just think what Alcoholics Anonymous done for me. It gave me a life that I didn't even want. Needless, wanted to apply to my own life. Those steps were the key to me building a successful life. My relationship with my family was a whole lot better. I remember my sisters and them, they wasn't bad at all. They would stop me from coming in their condominiums and houses. I would steal from them. And when I got sober in AA, they was glad for me to bring the kids over and talk with them. And that's what AA done. AA gave me the ability to leave my sister and them stuff alone. And they was bragging on me like, "Yeah, my brother there, he don't drink. And it's a joyous occasion. Yesterday I took my sisters out for dinner because my sisters are 80 years old. You wouldn't believe it. I'm 71 and I know I don't look 71. And my brother, he was sick and I told him, "No, you stay home." And my sister, my baby sister, she probably about 60s, 8 or something, something like that. And her husband is taking dialysis and he kind of sick. So I took my other two sisters out. We went and ate. We had a ball. We was making so much noise in the restaurant. And I remember him saying, "Mom would be proud of you." He said, "Mom would be proud of you." And that's from you guys, from AA. My mother could never stop me drinking or using drugs, but you guys did. Said, "Welcome. We glad you're here." And I could never pay that debt back ever. And so that's why I just keep putting one foot in front of another and sticking my hand out the drums. I don't care who you are, you know. And that's the payback, you know. One thing about AA, my mother did get a chance to see me get sober. And she never came to, hear me talk, but my sisters would always tell her, like, "He's a good speaker." I don't give a lot of leads like I used to. A lot of times I might go into a meeting and I've been sober 36 years, and those guys may say, "We got a new guy here. We'll talk about step one." That's why it's so funny when I go to another city, I always call in a group and I go, or somebody will pick me up. And it'd be funny. And some of the guys are like, "Well, we got a new guy here. Let's do step one." And they'll go around the room talking and they'll say, "Well, what's your sobriety date?" And I tell them, and they look at me like, "What?" And I say, "I'm new to this meeting and today is my first day in this meeting. But I've been sober for a long time, but it means absolutely nothing. All I got is today, this one day. And this is all I'm focusing on, one 24-hour period. I ain't even worried about tomorrow because it ain't even promised, you know. And I can tell you that AA gave me so much, I could never, ever pay that debt back, ever. I could never pay it back. And I've been dating a woman that she don't know nothing about AA. It's so funny because, people that's not alcoholics, they don't understand it. They think that like, you can just stop. And it's not that easy. It's not that easy at all. And I try to explain it to her, and I catch myself saying she don't know what I'm talking about. And I tell her about the Al-Anon groups and stuff like that. And we're gonna try to work through this, because like I say, a lot of times, I still go to 4, 5 meetings a week, and I still stick my hand out to drums and, because I love Alcoholics Anonymous. And if I didn't say anything else, I just want you to know that I love Alcoholics Anonymous, because the life that I have, I wouldn't trade it for anything in this world. If you knew in this meeting, tonight you just heard somebody that had no intentions of getting sober, and there wasn't a fiber in my body that wanted to get sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. And today I'm sober by the grace of God, Alcoholics Anonymous. If I said something today that was offensive, hurt, or harm anybody in this meeting, it was not my intent. I'm just here tonight to share my experience, scripts, and hope. If I said something, I hope that each member in this meeting tonight would just remember is really this. Keep coming back to Alcoholics Anonymous and give it a chance to work in your life. And God bless you, and thanks for having me.
Just a quick reminder to subscribe, like, or follow if you like the show on any of your favorite listening platforms. If you like the speakers and other content on the podcast, please show us some love by leaving a review and consider making a PayPal contribution to help keep the show going at paypal.me/a shot glass of recovery. Every dollar makes a difference, and we thank you. Our speakers come from my AA home group, AA Solution Seekers. We meet every day at 7 a.m., so pop in sometime and say hello. Until next time, thanks for joining me on A Shot Glass of Recovery.
Everything you do, the answer lies inside you.